All right, welcome to section 2 of the week 2 lecture. We're going to introduce Visual Studio today. So if you haven't installed Visual Studio yet, you'd want to look at the lecture slides from week 1, go to the link in the lecture slides and download Visual Studio again. If you have a Mac, you're going to want to install maybe Parallels. There's a link in the slides. Where to get Parallels for about $40. Then you're going to need to install Windows on the Mac through Parallels. You can download Windows for free through Microsoft Imagine. You have a Microsoft Imagine account for free through Marquette. Or you can purchase the Windows 10 operating system, install it. Once you install Windows, then you want to install Visual Studio. For the sake of this class, you always want to install Visual Studio on a Windows operating system. Otherwise, a lot of the exercises that we're going to work on would not work for you. Right? So assuming you have Visual Studio installed, probably Visual Studio 2017, 2015 should be just as good, right? You might not have installed the right workloads yet, so I'm going to walk through that real quick. The way you would probably find out if you have the right workloads is by going to File, New, Project. So we're going to create a new project, and the method for doing that is go to File, New, Project, and you should see in this list a list of programming languages that are supported by Visual Studio. This is Visual Studio C#. For the sake of this class, everything we build is going to be Visual C#. There are other programming languages like Visual Basic, Visual F#. We're going to use some SQL Server stuff. There might be some Python and other projects that you can have. We would not be touching any of those in this class. So always make sure you have Visual C# selected. Very important. For this lab assignment and tutorial, you'd be looking to use the console app. We'll be building a console app, the little black screen. You would see an example of it. And for everything we do in this class, select the .NET framework instead of the .NET Core framework, right? So .NET framework console app is what we're going to use. But I want to show you where to find your workloads real quick. So if you click on Open Visual Studio Installer, that would tell you what you have installed. So when you were running through the Visual Studio installation, there's a good chance you might not have selected the right workloads. This would help you determine if you have the right workloads in place. Sometimes it takes a while, so I would let this run, and through the magic of recording, I would come back and show you what that looks like. All right, so if everything works, you're going to come to a screen that looks something similar to this. If you're going to be building web apps, you're going to want to select this workload and that workload. This would allow us to build console apps. So if you don't have this one selected, you would not see the console app options. You're going to want to select ASP.NET and web development so you can build web applications. If you're looking to build iOS or Android apps, then you might come in and select mobile development with .NET. This would chew up a lot of space on your machine, so if you're not looking to do web development, then you don't need to install that. Down the road, if you want to do game development, you can install this workload, but we're not going to do that. If you enjoy writing code in Python, you could also install the Python workload. Right? So for the sake of this class, make sure you have these two workloads, .NET Desktop Development and then ASP.NET and Web Development. And then once you make changes, you can go ahead and run the installer. Just so you know, it's going to take a while to do that update. So if you need to pause this video to do that, feel free to do that. Right? It's going to eat up quite a bit of your time. Now, assuming you have the right workloads installed, then you select C#. Make sure you have console app selected. And this is where we'll set the name of our project. Right? So we would have a project. We're going to build a Hello World application. This is typically the first application that you build in programming. Now, I'm naming this project Hello World. You can name it whatever you choose to, right? It's just the name of a project. Now, the solution name typically would match the name of the project. This would be what .NET framework we're working with. Don't worry too much about that. Most importantly, this location tells you where on your computer this folder or project is going to be saved to. This is very important. Throughout this class, lots of students struggle with this. I have no idea why, but at the beginning of the semester, lots of students have a hard time finding where are my folders, where did things go. So please pay attention and replay this as many times as you need to if you can't figure out where your project got saved to. So when you create a project, you would be specifying where the project is saved to. By default, in my case, it's going to save to my users folder. This is my account source/repos, right? You could change that location. You can click on browse and maybe change it to your desktop. So you might decide to save it to your desktop or something like that, right? I would recommend, if you are not too sure where this folder is on your computer, select your desktop so it would save it to your desktop. We would need to find where you saved the project because we would have to zip the file, the project folder that contains all the files, and upload that to D2L. So all throughout the semester, you would need to upload your work to D2L. There is no way for you to upload all the individual files in your project to D2L comfortably without compressing them. So there's this concept of compressing or zipping files in Windows, right? It's just a concept with the Windows operating system. You might not have had to use that in the past, but that's very important in this class. And in fact, it's a good technical skill to have in general, right? It's a general skill. You want to be able to zip files and unzip files. You might not have done that yet. So please pay attention to where you're saving the file, right? Once you have this all selected, hit OK, and you should end up with something that looks like this. Now, we're going to talk briefly about a couple of the windows in Visual Studio, and it's very important because this is going to be on your quiz. You're supposed to know when to look for different things and where to find them in Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is not very complicated. It looks like there's a lot of things going on, and sometimes people might get confused. Just like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft PowerPoint, to your typical file, save, open, new, so on and so forth. We're going to work with some of these options as we go, right? This little icon, if you hover over it, says open file. If you have a file open and you want to save it, you click this little save icon. If you have multiple files open and you want to save all those files, you want to click save all, right? When we write a program and we're ready to run it, we will click start. Start, if you remember what we talked about in the day one lecture, you would need to compile your English code down into bits, right? Zeros and ones that the CPU can actually understand and work with. To make that happen, we have a compiler that is part of Visual Studio that compiles your C# code. So when you click on start, it's actually compiling all this English code down into machine code that the computer can understand, right? Here's a quick outline of what's going on in Visual Studio here. And I've made my screen a little bit, my code text a little bit bigger so we can kind of get an idea of what's going on. First, most important part of Visual Studio here is this Solution Explorer. So you probably want to take some notes. The Solution Explorer is where you would see all the files in your project. So a project would have multiple files. And the hierarchy is, if you create a program in Visual Studio, you're always going to have a solution. There is a solution which is the highest level of the hierarchy. Solutions can have multiple projects. By default, you only have one project, so you can see this is indented, right? So this project, Hello World, is a subset of this bigger solution, which is also called Hello World. And when I expand Hello World, that has a bunch of files, right? We're not going to work with any of these files except for the program.cs. So program.cs, right, is the code file. This is where we're actually going to write our C# code. Only specifically for a console app. So for console apps, all our code is going to go in program.cs. Eventually, we'll learn how to create new classes, but don't worry too much about that. So Solution Explorer contains all your files. It's going to be on your quiz, so make sure you remember what that is. Team Explorer, we won't waste too much time on it yet, but when we need to connect this to source control, GitHub, Visual Studio, so on and so forth, then we would look into that. This other window here is the properties window. So in some cases, we would have some widgets that we drag and drop onto a screen when we're building web apps. Those widgets, we like to call them controls. Controls would have properties, and the way we set the attributes of those controls, or properties if you will, would be through this window. For today's demo, you don't really get to use this very much, but I have this program.cs file selected, and it has some properties, so I can change the build action. There are a couple different things I can change in here, the file name, so on and so forth. Don't worry too much about that today, but note that the properties window is typically found here. Now you could move this around, right? I just clicked on it and dragged it and reposition this wherever you want to, right? But by default, it's better to have it here. You can move all those windows around. You can auto hide. So if you want to save space and create more space, make this a little bit bigger. I selected that, and then I click on this auto hide pin, and that's what made it possible for me to get that out the way, right? So you might do that from time to time. If for whatever reason you don't see this window open, you might be able to find it under View. So if you click on the View menu, you're going to find all those windows. Right? Solution Explorer is right here. There's going to be some properties options right under other windows, so on and so forth. A whole bunch of windows that you can use in Visual Studio. The toolbox window is where we're going to find all the controls, the little widgets that we're going to use to build web pages and so on and so forth. So for today, just be aware that toolbox would contain the widgets. In a console app, there are no widgets. It's just a blank black screen, right? So there's no drop-down control or button control or anything like that. But when we start building web apps and mobile apps, we would need a toolbox. A toolbox would contain predefined controls, right, for .NET. I'm going to hide that to create more space. We're going to have some output window here, but most importantly, this is the window that shows where your code would be. So in this case, I have program.cs. It was open by default, but it's its own window. I can close it out, and this becomes a blank screen. And when I double click on this, I can open that file and work with it, right? So for the sake of what we're going to do, we want to get the screen to print hello world, right? And to do that, imagine that the computer is a dumb machine and you are the smartest thing alive, and you're trying to tell the computer how to print something on the screen, but it knows instructions in a specific format. We like to call that format some syntax, right? So the syntax of code. That's the format in which the code should be written. So the hierarchy of the way code is typically set up in this console app is we would have a namespace, which is just the name of the project, Hello World, which I defined when I created the project. It's in a class that has a name of program. Now namespaces can have multiple classes, right? So let's make a note. At any time I use these two slashes, you see that goes in green. That means I'm adding comments to my code. I'm only doing that to help you figure out, so you can take some notes. Namespaces have multiple classes, or they can have multiple classes. By default, we only have one class, right? A class can if only I can spell, can have multiple methods. A method is this main static void main block here. It's a block of code. This is where we're going to write most of our code. I'm only adding comments in here to give you some direction. Now these curly braces are very important. Anytime you open a curly brace in C#, you must have an associated closing one. Notice the code is indented and you can see a couple dots to align these, right? You want to write your code in the indented section, so you make sure that every opening curly has an associated closing. So I have 1, 2, 3 open curlies, 3 closing curlies. You never want to take away one of these curlies. Your code is going to break and you're going to have a hard time troubleshooting, right? All right, so let's move ahead. So to actually type in some code to print something on the screen, we have to use a command called console.writeLine. Right, so I'm going to try to spell it out. So I start typing in console. That is the right word. Notice that goes, the color changes, and I get a suggestion. This suggestion of console, because Visual Studio is intelligent. It tries to figure out what I'm trying to get at, right? Am I trying to type in the keyword console, console color, console key, so on and so forth, right? This feature of Visual Studio is called IntelliSense. It intelligently senses what you're looking to do, right? And that's why it's better to write your code in Visual Studio on IDE than to write it in Notepad, for example, right? You don't get IntelliSense in Notepad. All right, so I'm looking to write console dot, and it figures, well, if you do dot, console has a bunch of methods and properties that you can call, right? So I'm going to be calling a method called WriteLine. Don't worry too much about that yet. So I start typing in WriteLine. Notice this is uppercase W. That was uppercase C. So WriteLine. And then I'm going to have a semicolon at the end. So console.WriteLine. And I wanted to say hello world. Right? So that's all I need to do. Now, this console.WriteLine is case sensitive. So C# code is case sensitive. That simply means if I were to write console console.WriteLine, something like this, actually, and I take away this uppercase C and used lowercase c, my code would not work. Notice I have what we call the red squiggly line. That is giving me an alert that this keyword is probably not accurate. It says the name console does not exist in the current context because lowercase c is not the same as uppercase C, right? Unlike maybe Python or other programming languages, C# is case sensitive. I must use uppercase C. In the same vein, I can't write console.WriteLine with lowercase l for the line. It expects this method name to be uppercase L. Hover over it, it says console does not contain a definition of WriteLine, right? Because I didn't type it in correctly. I also get a little light bulb icon. If you click on that, it kind of makes a suggestion. It knows what you wrote isn't right, but potentially maybe you're looking to use console WriteLine. So it's saying change WriteLine to WriteLine. Sometimes it might be right, sometimes it might not be right. It's just trying to figure out what are you trying to communicate. Ideally, you want to know what you're trying to do, so these suggestions would actually be relevant. So I selected that, and that fixed this problem here. So maybe I want to type in INSY. Still want to for INSY 4051. Now I'm going to do something here to stop the screen. So if I were to run this code at this point, I wouldn't be able to see what gets printed on the screen, right? So I'm going to use a technique that allows me to pause the screen so I can see what's actually outputted on it. So now I've got a line that says console.writeLine hello world, and I've got console.writeLine INSY 4051 and console.read. Now notice the sequence of the code is very important because I want hello world to show up first, then I want to show INSY 4051, right? And then I want to pause the screen. So it's very important that you pay attention to the logic of your code, right? The sequence, the first line, is going to be printed first, then the next line, so on and so forth, right? Now to run the code, I'm going to click on Start. So this is where you click on Start to run the program. We're going to run this program. And as you can see, I have a little black screen. This is called the console in Windows. Every Windows machine has a console, right? And I see hello world, the first line, INSY 4051, and my little blinking line there, right, which is waiting to read something. We won't worry too much about that today. If I need to go back and make changes to my code, maybe I made a mistake, it might be useful to stop running the program first before I can actually make changes, right? So stop running the program. I can either close out the window from here, or I can click Stop Debugging, right? Red means stop, green means go or run. So I'm going to stop it, and it closes out the console window. So this is the basic idea of how we would write code in Visual Studio. Now I'm going to show you a couple different things here. I'm going to click the error list window to illustrate how you could determine if you have errors in your code and how to debug them, for example. So let's say I have lowercase c, right? So I get this little squiggly line. The error list window is now going to tell me something about the error. So it says the name console does not exist in the current context, right? So I might be able to go on Google and search for what is CS003, or what does this error mean? Let me see if I could copy this error. I'm going to fire up Chrome and go to the infamous Google search and see if I could figure out what this error means. So if I were to search for this on Google, and it looks like my connection might not be working well through my VM, perhaps. Let's see if I can else. But essentially, if this were working, I don't have my internet connection working in my VM for whatever reason, then I would be able to search for this error message. But it might be useful if I can search using the keyword C#. I can qualify that search term with C#. It would give me some better results, so on and so forth. Notice if I take out the semicolon at the end, right? Every statement in C# needs a delimiter, right? We need at the end of every sentence, every code statement. A sentence in English writing would be equivalent to a C# statement. It's a complete line of code instruction, right? So a statement needs to be closed with a semicolon. If I take that out, it says semicolon expected, right? And I've got a red squiggly line here, another squiggly line here. So I'm going to if I know what I'm doing, I would close it out with the semicolon. This is just something you're going to have to get used to, right? If I were to take out the semicolon here, I get, this one error message. So you might have multiple errors if you're making lots of mistakes. You have to be detailed oriented when you're writing code, right? If everything is working, then you should be able to upload this by zipping this file. So this is lab 2, but one of the things I'm going to maybe draw your attention to is data types, right? So just like Microsoft Access, Microsoft, other tools that you might have used, SQL Server, MySQL, we have data types in C#. So there's this concept of a string, an integer, short int, Boolean values. Boolean values are true false values. date, time. There are all kinds of data types in C#. When we're working with strings, we're going to need to put double quotes around the actual value. So I wanted to print out hello world. I can't just put in console write line INSY, right? C# doesn't recognize what this is, so I get squiggly lines. So I need to put double quotes around it, not single quotes, double quotes around strings. And we'll get to know in integers, Boolean, datetime, and the other data types next week. Right? So if you've done this, this concludes the Lab 2 exercise. You can run it, but now you need to figure out how to upload this to D2L for Lab 2. To do that, if you don't know where you saved your file to, you could simply select the Hello World, the project, not the solution, the project, then right-click on it. You should have an option all the way down that says Open Folder in File Explorer. You launch that thing up, and then you go up 2 folders, right? So this is the folder, this is the other folder. This is the solution file that points to all the files in this folder. Do not upload this or this. Go up to the previous folder that contains the bigger parent folder, Hello World. Right-click on that, click on Send to Compressed. You might get file not found or no read permission. That's because I still have this thing open and running. I'm going to close out of Visual Studio. I would save this. Then I can come back and right-click on it, Send to Compressed, and now it creates a zip file. Notice it's got a little zipper on it. This is the file that you want to upload to D2L. This is your zip file. This file contains your project, and you should be able to upload that. And that concludes all we need to do for this lab exercise and for this lecture. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day. Take care.